The cold night air, once a source of terror in the warehouse, now felt like a cleansing balm as I stumbled through the desolate riverfront, away from the looming shadow of the old building. My lungs burned, my muscles ached, and my hands were raw from scrambling over crates, but a profound sense of relief washed over me. Mrs. Vance was gone, the rowboat was gone. She had made it. She was free. The wooden bird, still clutched in my hand, felt less like a burden and more like a talisman of my desperate, reckless triumph. I didn't stop running until the warehouse was a distant, dark silhouette against the faint orange glow of the city lights. The roar of the mills, usually a constant presence, seemed muted at this hour, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl and the creak of unseen shadows. I slipped back into our tenement, exhausted, trembling, but alive. I collapsed onto my bed, the wooden bird still in my grasp, its red eyes seeming to gleam in the darkness. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, punctuated by flashes of Julian Thorne's enraged face and the chilling sight of his macabre collection. But beneath the fear, a new feeling stirred, a quiet, fierce determination. I had faced danger, I had risked everything, and I had helped Mrs. Vance escape. Now I had to finish what I started. The mystery wasn't over. Julian Thorne was still out there, a dangerous madman with a chilling obsession. And the dark stain on Alistair Vance's past, the mill fire, the vanished Foreman O'Malley. That secret still hung heavy in the air, a truth that needed to be exposed. The next morning, the city felt different. The usual hustle and bustle seemed to hum with an underlying tension. The newspapers, of course, were still filled with the Vance case, but the tone had shifted. There was a new urgency, a renewed hope. Inspector Davies, spurred by the brooch I had found, had intensified his efforts, and the city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next development. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep the diary or the knowledge of Julian, Thorne's camp, to myself any longer. The reward, the money that could save my family, now seemed a secondary concern. What mattered was justice and ensuring Mrs. Vance's safety and bringing Julian Thorne to account for his madness. After Pa left for the mills and Ma began her laundry, I retrieved Mrs. Vance's diary from its hiding place. Its worn leather felt warm in my hands, a silent testament to the horrors it contained. I also took the wooden bird, its crude craftsmanship and red eyes, a chilling reminder of Julian Thorne's twisted mind. These were my proof, my silent witnesses. My heart pounded as I walked to the police station. This time I didn't feel small or insignificant. I felt a grim resolve. The desk sergeant, the same mountain of a man with the walrus mustache, recognized me immediately. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the serious expression on my face. "Back again, boy?" he grunted, but his tone held less skepticism than before. "I need to see Inspector Davies," I said, my voice firm. "It's urgent. It's about Mrs. Vance and Julian Thorne." The name Julian Thorne seemed to stiffen him. He nodded, then motioned me into the inspector's office without a word. Inspector Davies looked up from a stack of papers, his brow still furrowed, but his eyes held a flicker of recognition. "Ah, the young paper boy," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. "What brings you here this time?" I didn't waste words. I placed the leather-bound diary on his desk, then the wooden bird beside it. "This is Mrs. Vance's diary, sir," I began, my voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "And this is from Julian Thorne's hideout. I found him, sir, in an old warehouse on the riverfront. And Mrs. Vance, she was there. I helped her escape." Inspector Davies' weariness vanished, replaced by a sudden intense focus. He picked up the diary, his eyes scanning the elegant script, then looked at the wooden bird, his brow furrowing in confusion. A hideout? You helped her escape? His voice was low, incredulous. I recounted everything. The diary's entries, the dark stain on Alistair Vance's past, the mill fire, the vanished foreman O'Malley. Julian Thorne's blackmail, his increasing possessiveness, his twisted obsession with Mrs. Vance and her jewels, the final frantic entry about the old warehouse. My search for the warehouse, finding the hidden camp, Julian Thorne's macabre, collection of wooden birds and porcelain doll parts, Mrs. Vance's terror, my desperate plan to create a diversion, the crashing barrels, the chase through the dark warehouse, and her escape in the rowboat. I spoke for what felt like an eternity, pouring out the entire terrifying story, holding nothing back. Inspector. Davies listened intently, his face growing grimmer with each word. He examined the diary, turning its pages, his eyes widening as he read the frantic final entries. He picked up the wooden bird, scrutinizing its crude craftsmanship, then looked at me, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and grudging admiration in his gaze. "A macabre collection, you say?" he murmured, more to himself than to me. "And the doll parts? You saw them?" "Yes, sir," I confirmed, a shiver running down my spine as I remembered the chilling sight. "Just like the ones I saw at the Miller farm, sir. The ones from the Salt River Valley." His eyes snapped to mine. "The Miller farm? You know of that business?" "Yes, sir," I said, a new connection forming in my mind, a chilling thread linking two seemingly disparate horrors. "I saw them. I saw what they did. The bones, the pit, and the doll parts. Julian Thorne, he's like them, sir. He collects them." A grim realization dawned on Inspector Davies's face. The two mysteries, the vanished millionaire's wife and the horrors of the Kentucky frontier, were now intertwined by a common thread of madness. Julian Thorne wasn't just a blackmailer. He was a collector, a man driven by a dark, inexplicable compulsion, a madness that echoed the unspeakable acts of the Miller family. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sergeant!" he bellowed, his voice suddenly booming with authority. "Assemble a team. We're going to the old Henderson warehouse on the riverfront. And send a telegram to the Kentucky authorities. We have a lead on the Miller family." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "You've done a remarkable thing, Finn," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "A truly remarkable thing." He didn't mention the reward, but his words were a greater acknowledgement than any sum of money. Within hours, the police descended upon the old warehouse. I didn't go with them, but I watched from a distance, the familiar sight of carriages and stern-faced officers filling the desolate riverfront. Later that day, the news spread like wildfire. Julian Thorne had been apprehended, found hiding in a small, abandoned shack further downriver, still clutching the silver locket. And inside the warehouse, they had found his chilling collection, more wooden birds, more porcelain doll parts, and other small, macabre trinkets, each one a silent testament to his twisted obsession. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, weak but alive, was found. Later that day, having managed to row the dilapidated boat several miles downriver before collapsing on the bank. She was reunited with a distraught and relieved Mr. Vance, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The mystery was solved. The millionaire's wife was safe. The Pittsburgh Dispatch screamed new headlines. "Julian Thorne apprehended. Millionaire's wife rescued. Paperboy uncovers truth." My name was finally in print, a small, proud acknowledgement of my role. The reward, a staggering sum, was indeed given to my family, changing our lives forever. Pa's cough began to ease. Ma's worried lines softened, and we moved to a small, comfortable house with a garden, far from the grime and noise of the tenements. But for me, Finn, the world had changed irrevocably. I was no longer just a paper boy. I had walked into the heart of darkness, faced a madman, and helped bring a millionaire's wife home. The wooden bird, a chilling memento, remained hidden in my new room, a silent reminder of the secrets I had uncovered, and the thin, terrifying line between wealth and madness, between civilization and the unspeakable horrors that could lurk beneath its surface. The city of Pittsburgh, with its smoke and its steel, now held a deeper meaning for me, a place where even the grandest fortunes could hide the darkest truths, and where a simple boy could stumble upon a mystery that would forever define his life. That unsettling, thudding sound and the faint, human-like keening clung to me like burrs after that day. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling, a cold dread that settled in the pit of my stomach whenever my thoughts drifted to the red clay ridge. Pa, true to his nature, didn't press me for details, but I saw the worry etched deeper into his face. Ma, ever observant, would often catch me staring out the window towards the distant ridge, a faraway look in my eyes. She'd just sigh, a soft, weary sound, and pull me closer, as if her warmth could ward off the unseen chill. The community, small and tightly knit as it was, began to feel the strain of the disappearances more acutely. It wasn't just drifters now. A young trapper named Silas, known for his prowess with a snare and his boisterous laugh, vanished after saying he was heading towards the Salt River, a route that would take him uncomfortably close to the Miller farm. Then, a few weeks later, a family from the next valley over, the McIntyres, who had been on their way to the settlement for supplies, simply never arrived. Their wagon was found abandoned by the old oak tree that marked the turnoff to the Miller property. Its contents, undisturbed but no sign of the family. Fear, like a slow-burning fire, began to spread. People started to avoid the trails near Red Clay Ridge, taking longer, more arduous detours. Children were kept closer to home, their usual freedom curtailed. The laughter that once echoed through the woods seemed to dim, replaced by a nervous quiet. Even the Sunday meetings, usually a source of comfort and camaraderie, became hushed affairs, punctuated by anxious glances and whispered prayers for the missing. I, however, found myself drawn to the mystery. Perhaps it was the recklessness of youth, or perhaps it was the gnawing curiosity that refused to be silenced. I couldn't shake the image of the Miller children, Jed and Caleb with their blank stares, and Lily with her unnervingly still eyes, an ever-present doll. They were part of the puzzle, and I felt an inexplicable pull to understand them. One crisp autumn morning, a few weeks after the McIntyres vanished, I was out with Pa checking our traps. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the leaves were turning, painting the forest in fiery hues. We were deeper into the woods than usual, near the boundary line that Pa always warned me not to cross. Suddenly, Pa stopped, his hand raised, signaling for silence. I froze, my heart thumping. "Hear that, Thomas?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. I strained my ears. At first, nothing but the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. Then, a faint, high-pitched scratching sound, irregular and persistent. It seemed to come from just beyond our property line, in the direction of the Miller farm. It wasn't a natural sound, not like an animal digging or branches scraping. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, yet also too frantic. Pa slowly, cautiously moved forward, his rifle held ready. I followed, my breath held tight in my chest, my eyes wide. We crept through the thicket, the scratching growing louder, accompanied now by a low, guttural murmur. We parted a curtain of tangled vines and thorny bushes, and what we saw made my blood run cold. It was Jed Miller, the older of the two boys, maybe 15 or 16, his back to us. He was kneeling beside a freshly dug mound of earth, his hands, covered in mud, frantically scratching at the loose soil. Beside him, a small, crudely fashioned wooden box lay open, and within it I could just make out a tangle of dark hair. He was murmuring to himself, a low, unintelligible drone, as if comforting something. Pa pulled me back, his hand clamping over my mouth, stifling the gasp that threatened to escape. We pressed ourselves against the rough bark of an old oak, hidden by the shadows. Jed continued to scratch, and then, with a sudden violent movement, he plunged his hands into the earth, pulling something out. It was a doll, a child's doll, its fabric stained with mud, its button eyes staring blankly. It was Lily's doll. Jed held it up, his face still turned away from us, and then he began to rock it gently, still murmuring. He wasn't burying anything. He was unearthing something, and the frantic scratching, the low murmuring, it was all for this mud-stained doll. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate then, but it spoke of a deep, disturbing attachment, a twisted form of play. After a few tense minutes, Jed carefully placed the doll back in the box, recovered it with earth, and then, with a final pat, stood up. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements devoid of any emotion, and then melted back into the woods, heading towards his family's farm. Pa didn't move until Jed was long gone. When he finally released me, I could feel the tremor in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and grim understanding. He didn't say a word as we walked back, but the silence between us was heavier than any silence I had ever known. It was the silence of unspoken dread, of a terrible truth glimpsed but not yet fully comprehended. That night, by the flickering light of our hearth, Pa told Ma what we had seen. Ma listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face growing paler with each word. When Pa finished, she just shook her head slowly. "They're not right, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're not right at all." The incident with Jed and the doll solidified the growing unease. It wasn't just the disappearances anymore. It was the chilling behavior of the Millers themselves, their isolation, their strange self-sufficiency, the unsettling sounds I had heard, and now Jed's bizarre ritual with Lily's doll. It all pointed to something far more sinister than mere eccentricity. It pointed to a family that existed outside the bounds of normal human behavior, a family that seemed to thrive on a darkness that repelled all others. I started to notice other things, small details that, when pieced together, formed a disturbing pattern. The Millers' farm, though productive, always seemed unnaturally quiet. There were no barking dogs, no squawking chickens, no lowing cattle. The sounds of a working farm were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness, and sometimes, on windless nights, I would catch a faint metallic tang in the air, carried from the direction of their farm, a smell I couldn't quite place, but which made my stomach churn. It was a smell that hinted at something unwholesome, something that didn't belong in the clean, fresh air of the Kentucky wilderness. The fear in the community solidified into a grim acceptance that something was terribly wrong, but no one knew what to do. The law, such as it was on the frontier, was distant and slow, and who would believe the whispers of a few frightened settlers against a family that kept to themselves? Besides, there was a primal fear that kept people from directly confronting the Millers. It was the fear of the unknown, of a darkness so profound that it defied understanding. But for me, Thomas, the fear was slowly being replaced by a desperate need to know. The image of Jed and the doll, the thudding and keening, the metallic smell, they were fragments of a nightmare that I felt compelled to understand. I knew Pa's warnings were for my own good, but the pull of the red clay ridge, of the farm of horrors, was becoming irresistible. It was a dangerous game, I knew, but a boy's mind, once ignited by a mystery, is hard to extinguish. And the Millers, in their terrifying silence, were the greatest mystery of all. I felt a growing certainty that I wouldn't be able to stay away, that the answers I sought lay hidden within the dark confines of their farm, waiting to be unearthed, just like Lily's doll. The image of Jed Miller, kneeling by that freshly dug mound, murmuring to a mud-stained doll, haunted my waking hours and crept into my dreams. It was a strange, disquieting tableau that defied explanation, yet it felt like a key, a twisted clue, to the unsettling mystery of the red clay ridge. Pa's silence on the matter, and Ma's worried glances, only deepened my resolve. They wanted me to stay away, to forget what I'd seen, but how could I? The unknown, when it hummed with such dark energy, was a powerful magnet to a boy's inquisitive mind. Winter arrived, bringing with it a harsh, unforgiving cold that blanketed the Kentucky wilderness in a thick layer of snow. The world outside our cabin became a stark landscape of white and gray, and the trails grew impassable. This meant fewer travelers, fewer peddlers, and mercifully, fewer disappearances. The community breathed a collective, albeit temporary, sigh of relief. But the fear, like embers beneath ashes, still glowed. The Miller farm, shrouded in snow, looked even more isolated, a silent, ominous presence on the ridge. During those long, dark winter nights, huddled by the hearth, I would listen to the wind howl outside, and my thoughts would inevitably drift to the Millers. What did they do in their cabin, hidden from the world? Did they sit by a fire like us, or was their warmth found in some colder, darker pursuit? The metallic tang I'd sometimes smelled, the thudding and keening, they were not the sounds, or scents of a normal farm, even one struggling through winter. As the first thaw began, and the ice on the river started to crack, a new kind of restlessness settled over me. The long confinement had only intensified my curiosity. I knew with a certainty that defied Pa's warnings that I had to get closer to the Miller farm, not to confront, not to accuse, but simply to observe, to understand. I needed to see with my own eyes what lay behind that wall of silence. My opportunity came one early spring afternoon. Pa and Ma had gone to the settlement, a rare trip for both of them, to trade furs and stock up on salt and other necessities. They had left me in charge of the cabin and the livestock, a responsibility I usually relished. But that day the responsibility felt like a cloak of invisibility. I completed my chores with unusual speed, my heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. Once the chickens were fed and the woodpile replenished, I grabbed my hunting knife, a small pouch of dried jerky, and a water skin, and slipped out the back door. The air was crisp, and the ground was still damp from the melting snow, making my footsteps soft. I moved through the familiar woods, but with a new purpose, a new direction. I wasn't hunting game. I was hunting answers. I kept to the deer trails, moving cautiously, my senses heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me jump. I reminded myself of Pa's words. No good comes from that direction. But the words felt distant, drowned out by the insistent drum of my own curiosity. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour or so, the trees began to thin, and I knew I was approaching the edge of the Miller property. The air grew still, the sounds of the forest fading away. It was that unnatural quiet again, the one that always accompanied the thought of their farm. I crept forward, using the sparse bushes and the remaining snowdrifts for cover. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it, the Miller farm. It wasn't what I had imagined. I had pictured a ramshackle, decaying place reflecting the dark aura of its inhabitants. Instead, it was surprisingly neat, almost unnervingly so. The cabin, though weathered, stood sturdy. The fences were well maintained, and the fields, though still fallow from winter, were clearly prepared for planting. It was a farm, but it felt sterile. There was no smoke curling from the chimney, no sounds of life, no animals grazing. It was a picture of perfect, unsettling stillness. I found a good vantage point behind a cluster of thick pines, close enough to observe without being easily seen. I settled down, my heart still racing, and began to watch. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Nothing. No one emerged from the cabin, no movement in the fields. It was as if the farm was deserted, a ghost of a homestead. Just as I was beginning to think my venture had been a fool's errand, a flicker of movement caught my eye. The cabin door, a heavy slab of rough-hewn wood, slowly creaked open. First, Ilara Miller emerged, her dark dress blending with the shadows. She carried a large, empty wooden bucket. Her movements were slow, almost dreamlike, as she walked towards a small, dilapidated shed at the far end of the yard. She disappeared inside. For a moment, then reappeared, the bucket now seemingly heavy, though I couldn't see what was in it. She carried it back to the cabin, her head bowed, and vanished inside once more. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time it was Caleb, the younger of the two boys. He was carrying a shovel, its blade glinting dully in the afternoon. Light. He walked with the same quiet, almost detached gait as his mother, heading towards the back of the cabin, where a small, overgrown patch of ground lay hidden from the main path. He began to dig. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it. This was what I had come to see. He dug with a methodical, almost practiced rhythm, the shovel biting into the soft earth. He wasn't digging a garden patch. His movements were too precise, too deep. He was digging a hole, a grave-like depression. As he dug, Jed emerged from the cabin, carrying another wooden bucket, this one smaller than his mother's. He walked over to Caleb, and without a word, poured the contents of his bucket into the freshly dug hole. I couldn't see what it was, but a faint, sickly sweet smell, like something decaying, wafted on the breeze. It was the metallic tang I had smelled before, stronger now, undeniably putrid. Then, the most chilling sight of all. Lily, the youngest Miller, skipped out of the cabin, her ever-present doll clutched to her chest. She didn't go to her brothers. Instead, she went to a small, carefully tended patch of earth near the cabin's foundation, a patch I hadn't noticed before. She knelt down, and with her small, unchildlike hands, began to arrange small, smooth stones around the edges of the patch. It looked like a miniature grave. And then she began to sing, a soft, tuneless hum, like a lullaby, but one that held no comfort. Caleb finished digging, and Jed, with a grunt, began to push the earth back into the hole, burying whatever had been in the bucket. They worked in tandem, silent and efficient, like two parts of a single grim machine. When they were done, they smoothed the earth over, leaving no trace of their activity, and then walked back to the cabin, their faces as expressionless as ever. Lily continued her eerie lullaby by her miniature grave. I lay hidden for a long time. After they had disappeared back inside, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The scene I had witnessed was horrifying in its mundane efficiency. The digging, the pouring, the burying. It was all too practiced, too routine. And the smell was undeniable. It was the smell of death, of something being disposed, of quietly, meticulously. I understood then, with a sickening certainty, what Old Man Hemlock had meant when he said, "Their well runs deep." It wasn't a well for water. It was a well for secrets, for bodies, for the unspeakable acts that happened on the farm of horrors. The disappearances, the strange sounds, Jed's doll ritual, the metallic tang in the air, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. The Millers weren't just odd, they were monsters. And I, Thomas, had just seen a glimpse into their horrifying routine. The innocent curiosity that had driven me here was replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear. I knew I had to get back home, but the image of that freshly dug earth and Lily's chilling lullaby would be etched into my memory forever. The wilderness, once a place of adventure, now felt like a vast, dark shroud, concealing unspeakable horrors. I had found my answers, and they were far more terrifying than any whispered rumor. The journey back from the Miller farm was a blur of panicked footsteps and ragged breaths. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of terror that echoed the chilling scene I had just witnessed. The crisp spring air, once invigorating, now felt heavy with the stench of something rotten, a phantom odor clinging to my clothes and hair. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind me. I didn't stop running until our cabin came into view, a beacon of safety in the gathering dusk. Pa and Ma arrived home later that evening, their faces tired but relieved to see me safe. They asked about my day, about the chores, and I mumbled vague answers, my voice thin and reedy. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I had seen. How could I? The words felt too monstrous, too unbelievable even to my own ears. How could I explain the methodical, chilling routine of the Millers, the silent disposal of what? I didn't know, and the not knowing was almost as terrifying as the knowing. The image of Lily singing her eerie lullaby by that miniature grave was burned into my mind, a grotesque parody of childhood innocence. For days, I walked in a daze, the world around me muted, my thoughts consumed by the horrors of the red clay ridge. I avoided looking towards the ridge, avoided thinking about it, but it was like a festering wound that refused to heal. The once familiar sounds of our farm, the lowing of cows, the clucking of hens, the distant cry of a hawk, now seemed to carry an unsettling undertone, a reminder of the unnatural silence that hung over the Miller property. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares of shadowy figures digging in the earth, of silent, expressionless faces, plagued my nights. The fear in the community, which had subsided slightly during the harsh winter, now returned with renewed intensity, as spring brought more travelers and, inevitably, more disappearances. This time it was a young couple, newlywed, heading west to seek their fortune. They were last seen passing through our valley, their wagon loaded with their meager possessions, their faces bright with hope. They never reached the next settlement. Their abandoned wagon, like the McIntyres before it, was found near the old oak tree, stripped clean of anything valuable, but no sign of the couple themselves. The whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into desperate pleas. At the next Sunday meeting, the air was thick with tension. Old Man Hemlock, his face gaunt and his eyes wide with a terrible certainty, stood up and spoke, his voice trembling but clear. "It's the Millers," he declared, pointing a shaking finger towards the distant ridge. "They're taking them. I've known it in my bones for years, but now we have to act." A murmur went through the small congregation. Some nodded grimly, their faces reflecting the same dawning horror that had settled in my own heart. Others looked away, their fear still outweighing their conviction. To accuse a family, even one as strange as the Millers, of such unspeakable crimes was a grave matter, one that could lead to bloodshed and further tragedy. Pa, usually a man of few words, stood up. His face was grim, his jaw set. "We can't just accuse without proof, Hemlock," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we can't sit by either. More folks will vanish." He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, his friends. "We need to go there. We need to see for ourselves." A collective gasp went through the room. To venture on to the Miller farm, to confront them, was a terrifying prospect. It was one thing to whisper about them, another entirely to face them. But Pa's words, spoken with such quiet conviction, seemed to ignite a spark of courage in some. A small group of men, including Pa, agreed to ride to the Miller farm the following morning. They would go armed, not with aggression, but with a desperate need for answers. I wanted to go. Desperately. I had seen what they did. I had smelled the putrid scent of their secrets. I felt a terrible responsibility, a need to expose the truth. But Pa, seeing the fear and the fierce resolve in my eyes, shook his head. "No, Thomas," he said, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "You stay here with your ma. This is not for a boy." His voice was gentle, but his eyes held a steely determination that brooked no argument. The next morning, before dawn, I watched from our cabin window as Pa and the other men, grim-faced and silent, rode off towards the red clay ridge. The air was cold, the sky still dark, and a sense of profound dread settled over our farm. Ma and I spent the day in a tense silence, our ears straining for any sound from the direction of the Miller farm. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, made us jump. The hours stretched into an eternity. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, we heard it. The faint sound of horses returning. My heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Had they found something? Were they safe? Only 3 horses returned. Pa was among them, his face ashen, his clothes streaked with mud. The other 2 men, Mr. Henderson and young Ben Carter, looked equally shaken, their eyes wide and distant. 2 men were missing. Mr. Henderson's, brother Samuel and old Silas, a quiet farmer from the next valley. They hadn't returned. Pa dismounted, his movements stiff and slow like an old man. Ma rushed to him, her face full of questions, but he just shook his head, unable to speak. He stumbled into the cabin and sank heavily onto a chair by the hearth, staring into the dying embers. "What happened, Elias?" Ma finally whispered, her voice trembling. Pa took a deep, shuddering breath. "They weren't there," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "The cabin was empty. The farm, it was deserted." My blood ran cold. Deserted? But I had seen them just days ago. "We searched the property," Pa continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The fields, the outbuildings, nothing. No sign of them. No sign of Samuel or Silas either." He paused, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror. "But we found something. In the shed. The one Elara went into." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a pain I had never seen before. "There were barrels, Thomas, barrels filled with a strange, oily substance, and tools that looked like they were used for butchering. Not animals." He didn't need to say more. The metallic tang, the thudding, the keening, the freshly dug earth, Lily's miniature grave, it all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. The Millers weren't just burying things, they were processing them. The oily substance, the butchering tools, it was too sickening to contemplate. "And then," Pa continued, his voice barely a whisper, "we found the pit. Behind the shed, hidden by some overgrown bushes, a deep pit. And at the bottom, bones, human bones, and a child's shoe. A small red one," Ma gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. A child's shoe. The McIntyre's little girl had worn red shoes. "We didn't stay long after that," Pa said, his voice thick with horror. We just ran. Samuel and Silas, they must have stayed behind, or they were taken. We don't know." His voice trailed off, lost in the enormity of what they had discovered, the farm of horrors. It wasn't just a name whispered in fear anymore. It was a reality, a gruesome truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The Millers were gone, vanished into the wilderness as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind a chilling testament to their unspeakable crimes. But they had left something else behind, too. A community shattered by fear, haunted by the specter of their monstrous acts, and 2 more men lost to the depths of the red clay ridge. And I, Thomas, had been a witness, a silent observer to the dawning of a nightmare that would forever cast a long, dark shadow over the Kentucky frontier. The horror had a name, and it was far more terrible than any of us could have imagined. The words, "the old warehouse," "riverfront," "midnight," from Mrs. Vance's diary burned in my mind. I knew I couldn't go to Inspector Davies immediately. I needed to understand the dark stain on Alistair Vance's past first. My family's poverty, and Pa's worsening cough, spurred me on. I began searching Pittsburgh's sprawling riverfront for the old warehouse. An old dock worker pointed me to Old Henderson's warehouse, a dilapidated, supposedly haunted building. I found it, a massive, dark brick structure, its side door partially open. I didn't dare enter then, but the location was confirmed. Back. Home. Reading the diary, I discovered the dark stain, a terrible fire at Alistair's first mill years ago, where many lives were lost. Mrs. Vance wrote that Alistair had cut corners, and a foreman, O'Malley, who tried to speak out, vanished. Julian Thorne was using this secret to blackmail Alistair, and Mrs. Vance was his collateral. The final entries described her desperate plan to escape with jewels and Julian's discovery of it, ending abruptly with the old warehouse, riverfront, midnight. Driven by urgency, I slipped out that night, heading to the warehouse. The darkness inside was absolute, thick with the smell of decay. My candle's faint light revealed towering crates and barrels. I found a faint glimmer of light and crept closer. Peering around a stack of crates, I saw her. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, alive but terrified, bound in a makeshift enclosure. Julian Thorne sat nearby, humming unsettlingly, polishing a silver locket. My blood ran cold when I saw his macabre collection. On the floor, small, intricately carved wooden birds, just like the one I carried, and delicate porcelain doll parts. Julian Thorne was more than a blackmailer. He was a collector, a madman. When he almost spotted me, I knew I had to act. I spotted a stack of metal barrels and, with a surge of desperate strength, toppled them. The deafening clang shattered the silence. Julian Thorne leaped up enraged and moved towards the sound. This was my chance. I darted to Mrs. Vance, fumbled with her loose ropes, and freed her. "Go! To the river! There's a small boat," I whispered, pointing to an opening. She nodded, scrambled out, and vanished into the darkness. I didn't wait, instead running deeper into the maze of crates, hoping to lead Julian Thorne away. He pursued, me relentlessly shouting threats. I tripped, losing my knife, but found a loose wooden plank and swung it, catching his arm. I then scrambled up a stack of crates, scaling a precarious walkway towards a broken window high on the wall. He climbed after me, roaring. I squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling outside, and ran until I reached the riverbank. The rowboat was gone. Mrs. Vance was safe. Exhausted but resolute, I returned home. The next morning, I went to Inspector Davies, presenting Mrs. Vance's diary and the wooden bird. I recounted everything. The blackmail, the mill fire, Julian's madness, the warehouse, and Mrs. Vance's escape. I even linked Julian's collection to the horrors of the Miller farm. Inspector Davies, stunned, immediately dispatched a team. Julian Thorne was apprehended, still clutching the locket, and his chilling collection was found. Mrs. Eleanor Vance was rescued, weak but alive. The city erupted with news. My name was in the papers, and the staggering reward changed my family's life. We moved to a comfortable home, far from the tenements. But for me, Finn, the world had changed forever. I was no longer just a paper boy. I had faced darkness and helped bring justice. The wooden bird remained hidden, a silent reminder of the secrets I had uncovered in the city of smoke and steel.